She called the cops on a stranger at the pool, but had no idea who she really was. What would you do if someone accused you of trespassing in your own neighborhood? This is the true story of a quiet suburban town where everything looked perfect: neatly trimmed lawns, friendly waves from porches, and a sparkling community pool. But beneath the surface of comfort and order was something no one wanted to talk about: judgment, prejudice, and fear of the unfamiliar. Enter Dana Wilson, a poised, intelligent woman who had just moved into Willow Creek. She wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. She was simply enjoying a rare day off, floating peacefully in the community pool. But one neighbor saw her and made a snap decision: she doesn't belong here. That neighbor? Susan Whitaker, a longtime HOA volunteer and self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's order. She made one phone call that would change everything. But here's what Susan didn't know: Dana wasn't just any resident. She was the new chief of police. What happened next turned the whole town upside down and forced everyone to choose between comfort and truth. Stick around for the story of a confrontation that went viral, a woman forced to face her own bias, and a town learning what community really means. If this story moves you, don't just scroll, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the heart of humanity. It was one of those summer days that seemed to slow time itself. The sun hung high in the sky over Willow Creek, casting golden light across trimmed lawns and blooming hydrangeas. American flags fluttered gently in the breeze, and the smell of fresh-cut grass mingled with the soft hum of cicadas. The neighborhood looked like a postcard, each home nestled behind white fences, porches dressed with wicker chairs and hanging baskets, and sidewalks that curved gently past flower beds and mailboxes. From the outside, Willow Creek was the kind of place folks dreamed of retiring to, where everything felt orderly, peaceful, and safe. Children's laughter echoed through backyards as sprinklers spun in rhythmic circles. A boy in swim trunks ran across his front lawn, chasing a plastic airplane, while his sister squealed with delight, trying to keep up. Ice cream trucks made their slow crawl down Sycamore Lane, playing cheerful music that reminded everyone of simpler times. Lawn chairs were pulled out into driveways, and neighbors called greetings across hedges, fanning themselves with paper plates or sipping from tall glasses of sweet tea. At the center of the neighborhood sat the Willow Creek Community Pool, a modest but well-kept gathering place shaded by tall maples and protected by a black iron fence. A large sign outside read "Members Only, Welcome to our neighborhood." It was more than just a pool, it was the heartbeat of summer in Willow Creek. Grandparents brought their grandkids to splash in the shallow end. Young parents took turns wrangling toddlers and chatting about school plans. Teenagers, with sunburned noses and dripping hair, gathered near the diving board, showing off their latest flips and cannonballs. Inside the gates, the air smelled of chlorine and sunscreen. White lounge chairs circled the water's edge, and big blue umbrellas gave the sun-weary a place to cool down. A lifeguard sat perched on a tall white chair, sunglasses hiding his eyes, twirling a whistle in one hand. In one corner, a group of older women played cards, their feet soaking in the water as they teased each other and shared stories about their grown children and long-ago summers. Across the pool, a father in his late 40s helped his son learn how to float, gently guiding him with outstretched arms. Everything about the day was warm and ordinary. Familiar. Safe. But sometimes, even the most beautiful places can hold tension just beneath the surface. Like a ripple that starts at the edge of calm water, the first sign of trouble is often quiet, so small it's easy to miss. Nobody could have guessed that the gentle rhythm of that sunny day was about to break. That somewhere behind a pair of oversized sunglasses and a wide-brimmed sun hat, suspicion was brewing. The kind of trouble that changes a place doesn't always announce itself with shouting or sirens. Sometimes, it begins with a sideways glance. A feeling that something is out of place, not because it is, but because someone believes it is. And in Willow Creek, that belief was about to be tested. Because while the pool sparkled and the laughter carried on the breeze, a woman had just arrived. She didn't make a scene. She didn't cut in line or raise her voice. She simply walked through the gate like any other neighbor and laid her towel across an empty chair. She was new to the community, though not everyone knew it yet. And as she stepped into the cool, welcoming water, letting the sun warm her face and the water lift her weight, she had no idea that eyes were watching her, not with welcome, but with warning. In a town like Willow Creek, where everyone claimed to know everyone else, being unknown could feel like a crime. But the day had only just begun, and the true test of this neighborhood's heart was still ahead. Susan Whitaker had lived in Willow Creek for over 20 years. She knew every mailbox, every garden gnome, every face that passed her by at the grocery store. She took pride in keeping her corner of the world just the way she liked it, neat, polite, familiar. Her husband, Jim, had retired 5 years earlier, and the two of them filled their days with gardening, book clubs, church picnics, and Susan's personal favorite, volunteering for the Homeowners Association. The HOA gave her a sense of purpose. She was the unofficial eyes and ears of the community, always quick to notice if someone left their garbage bins out too long or parked just a bit too close to a stop sign. Susan didn't think of it as meddling. In her mind, it was about preserving the charm of Willow Creek. After all, someone had to keep an eye on things. She wore that invisible badge with pride. That Saturday, Susan had arrived early to the community pool, straw tote in hand, her wide-brimmed hat secured against the sun. She greeted the lifeguard, adjusted the pillows on her favorite lounge chair, the one nearest the rose bushes, and unfolded her magazine with the confident air of someone who believed she belonged, and believed she knew who else did too. She'd only just settled in when she saw Dana. A woman she didn't recognize. Black, about mid-30s, athletic build, wearing a simple navy one-piece and carrying a rolled-up beach towel. Susan sat up a little straighter. Something about the woman's ease, the way she moved as if she had every right to be there, set something off inside her. Dana walked calmly to an empty chair, laid down her towel, and slid her flip-flops off. She smiled at a passing child who dropped a pool noodle, helping her pick it up, then stepped lightly into the water as if she'd done it 100 times before. Susan's fingers tightened on her magazine. She couldn't recall seeing that woman at any HOA meetings. She hadn't noticed any moving trucks lately either, not that she noticed everything, but still. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of place where people just appeared. She watched Dana for several more minutes, her eyes narrowing. The woman was floating now, arms outstretched, eyes closed, the sunlight dancing across her skin. She looked perfectly at peace. But in Susan's mind, that was suspicious in itself. Who was she? Where had she come from? Did she even live in the neighborhood? Susan reached for her phone and opened the Willow Creek neighborhood app, scrolling through the recent updates, looking for a welcome message, a moving notice, anything that might explain this newcomer. Nothing. Not a word. She glanced around. No one else seemed to think anything was amiss. The lifeguard was distracted, teens were splashing in the deep end, and the older women playing cards had barely looked up. But Susan couldn't let it go. With a huff, she stood, smoothed her sun hat, and marched toward the edge of the pool. Her sandals slapped softly against the concrete, each step fueled by a certainty that she was doing the right thing. Dana opened her eyes as the shadow of the woman approached. "Excuse me," Susan said, her voice sharp, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Dana stood slowly, brushing water from her arms. "Yes," she said kindly. "I haven't seen you around here before," Susan said, folding her arms. "Are you a member?" Dana blinked, surprised but not yet defensive. "Yes, I am. I just moved into Willow Creek a couple of weeks ago." Susan's lips pursed. "Oh? Which street?" "Sycamore Lane," Dana replied, her tone still even. "The blue house on the corner." Susan frowned. "I know that house. It's been empty for months." "Well, it's not empty anymore," Dana said, giving a small, polite smile. "I have my membership card in my bag if you'd like to see it." Susan waved a dismissive hand. "That won't be necessary. I can check with the HOA office later." Her voice dropped to a chillier tone. "Right now, I'd prefer if you left. This pool is for residents only." "I am a resident," Dana said, her voice firmer now. I pay dues. I followed all the rules. I'm not going anywhere. Susan's brows drew together. She took a step closer. I don't think you understand. If you don't leave, I'll have to call the police. Dana stared at her, stunned. Are you serious? I most certainly am. Dana's heart pounded. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned her presence, but this time it cut deeper. She had moved to Willow Creek for peace. For a fresh start. Not to be treated like a trespasser in her own neighborhood. I told you, I live here, Dana said. I have every right to be here, just like you. A few poolgoers had begun to notice. Parents pulled their children a little closer. Conversations quieted. Susan, now emboldened by her own assumptions, pulled out her phone. You leave me no choice, she said, dialing. Yes, I need someone at the Willow Creek community pool. There's a woman here who refuses to leave. She's not cooperating. Dana said nothing. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes steady. She could have ended it right there, told Susan exactly who she was and what authority she held, but something inside her held back. She wanted to see what would happen. She needed to see it. As Susan gave her location to the dispatcher, Dana turned and stepped out of the water, wrapping her towel around her shoulders. The air felt colder now, even in the heat. She sat down on the edge of her lounge chair, watching the world around her shift. Children stopped splashing. Older residents looked away. A teenage girl mouthed, "Are you okay?" across the pool. Dana nodded, grateful for even that small act of kindness. Susan ended her call and turned toward Dana again. Help is on the way, she said, as if that settled it. I hope they hurry, Dana replied calmly, because you're going to be in for quite a surprise. Susan raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. She returned to her chair, posture stiff, eyes still locked on the woman she believed didn't belong. But the truth had a way of arriving whether people were ready for it or not. And the truth, this time, was already on its way, riding quietly in the front seat of a police cruiser, heading straight toward a moment that would change everything. Dana sat quietly at the edge of her lounge chair, her towel draped over her shoulders, drops of water still clinging to her skin. The sun had begun to dip slightly, casting a gentler light across the pool deck. The warmth remained, but something in the air had shifted. People were no longer laughing as freely. The chatter had softened. It wasn't silence exactly, it was something more uncomfortable. A tension, heavy and slow, that made even the smallest sound feel sharp. She watched as Susan returned to her seat with the air of someone who believed they had taken control of a situation. Susan placed her phone back into her bag, straightened her hat, and opened her magazine again as though nothing had happened. But she wasn't reading. Her eyes flicked above the pages every few seconds, making sure Dana hadn't moved. Dana looked around the pool area. Some people were pretending not to watch. Others weren't even trying to hide their stares. One woman with a toddler gave Dana a sympathetic glance. An elderly man by the gate slowly shook his head. Even the lifeguard looked uncertain, his eyes bouncing between Dana and Susan. Dana felt the weight of it all. The disbelief. The shame. The quiet judgment. And the anger, low, steady, simmering in her chest. She had done everything right. She had purchased the home herself. Signed the paperwork. Paid the HOA dues. Got her pool pass mailed, laminated, and tucked it into the front pocket of her bag, just like the welcome letter had said. She wasn't crashing a party. She wasn't sneaking in. She was exactly where she belonged. And yet, because of her skin, because someone had decided she didn't look like she fit the picture in their mind, she was now waiting for the police. On a Saturday afternoon, at her own community pool, she glanced down at her bag and slowly unzipped the front pouch. The membership card was there, just as she knew it would be, plastic, shiny, with her name in bold letters. She held it in her hand, turning it over, as if to remind herself that it was real. That this place was hers, too. Then she stood up and crossed the warm pavement to where Susan was sitting. I'm going to offer this one more time, Dana said, her voice steady but no longer soft. Here's my membership card. Take a look. Susan didn't move. Her eyes flicked to the card, then back to Dana's face. That won't be necessary, she said tightly. The police are on their way. They'll sort this out. Dana raised her eyebrows. Sort what out, exactly? Susan shifted in her seat. I told them you were refusing to leave and causing a disturbance. I offered you proof that I live here, Dana replied. That's not a disturbance. That's me trying to de-escalate. Susan gave a small shrug, as if she were shrugging off a stray leaf instead of a confrontation she had created. Well, if you'd just shown it to me sooner, maybe none of this would have happened. Dana felt the words sting. I offered. You refused. You assumed I didn't belong before you asked a single question. Susan looked away, pretending to be engrossed in her magazine. Dana stood for a moment longer, card still in hand, then turned and walked back to her chair. She could feel the eyes again. Some were sympathetic. Some curious. A few, no doubt, suspicious in their own way. The lifeguard stood up now, finally stepping down from his post. He approached Dana, his hands open, his voice quiet. Hey. I'm sorry about all this, he said, glancing nervously toward Susan. I didn't see anything wrong. I mean, you came in like anyone else. Dana gave a small nod. Thanks, she said. I appreciate you saying that. He hesitated. Is there anything I can do? Just stay nearby, she said. They'll be here soon, and I want someone around who saw what really happened. The lifeguard nodded and took a few steps back, staying close. Moments later, the distant sound of a car engine pulled into the parking lot. Dana turned to see a black and white police cruiser roll slowly past the entrance. Two officers stepped out. One was tall and broad-shouldered with a mustache and calm expression. The other was younger, hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her gaze sharp and alert. They looked around as they made their way to the gate, surveying the pool area with the experienced caution of people who had walked into too many situations without knowing how they might turn. Dana's chest tightened. This was the moment. She had to decide, was she going to tell them immediately who she was, or let it play out a little longer? She stayed seated. Susan, on the other hand, stood up immediately and waved them over, her voice eager. Officers, thank you for coming so quickly. She's over there, she said, pointing toward Dana. She refused to leave when I asked and got confrontational. Dana didn't move. She sat with her towel draped loosely over her lap, her membership card still in hand. The officers approached slowly. The male officer addressed her first. Ma'am, he said with a polite nod. We received a report about a disturbance. Are you a member of this facility? Yes, Dana said, lifting the card and handing it to him. Here's my membership. The officer took it, examined it closely, and passed it to his partner, who gave it a similar once-over before nodding. Everything looks in order, she said. Do you have any ID, just to verify the name? Dana reached calmly into her bag, pulled out her wallet, and handed them her license. The officer checked the names, then gave a small smile. Thank you, ma'am. That's all we needed. Across the pool, Susan was still hovering near the bushes, arms crossed, lips tight. Dana looked at the officers, her voice low but certain. Would you mind staying a few minutes longer? I'd like to file a complaint. The officers looked at each other. The female officer gave a respectful nod. Of course, she said. Let's step over to the patio so we can talk in private. Dana gathered her things, leaving the lounge chair exactly as she found it. She walked past Susan without a word, her posture upright, her expression calm. But inside, her heart was pounding. Not with fear. With resolve. Because this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Not this time. As Dana followed the officers toward the shaded patio near the vending machines, she felt the warm pavement beneath her feet and the heavy weight of what had just happened pressing against her chest. She didn't let it show. Her steps were steady, her shoulders back, her towel still wrapped around her like armor. But her heart beat with quiet fury. They reached a small round table in the corner, away from the pool and the murmuring crowd. A soda machine hummed beside them, the air smelling faintly of chlorine and warming plastic. The female officer motioned toward a chair, and Dana sat down, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I'm Officer Clara Morales," the younger one said gently. "And this is Officer Ray Turner. Can you tell us what happened from your perspective?" Dana nodded, her voice calm but firm. "I came to the pool today, like anyone else. I've lived in Willow Creek for a few weeks now. I moved into the blue house on Sycamore Lane. I have a membership here, which I offered to show. But before I could even finish explaining, the woman who called you insisted I leave and then claimed I was being aggressive. She never once accepted that I belonged here." Officer Turner took a few notes on a small pad, nodding slowly. "Did you say anything threatening to her?" "No," Dana said without hesitation. "I stayed calm. I offered to show my card, which she refused. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't make any threats. I just didn't leave when she told me to, because I have every right to be here." Morales looked over at Turner, then back at Dana. "It sounds like a misunderstanding, but if what you're saying is accurate, it could also be harassment. Do you want to file an official report?" Dana paused for a moment. She looked toward the pool where Susan was now pacing nervously near the gate, pretending to make herself busy with her bag, though clearly glancing their way. Dana took a breath and looked back at the officers. "I do," she said softly. "But first, I think it's time I properly introduce myself." She reached into her bag once more, unzipping a small inner pocket, and pulled out a flat black wallet. Inside, she removed her badge and her official identification. She held them out and placed them gently on the table. Officer Morales leaned forward first. Her eyes scanned the ID and widened slightly. Turner reached over, took a look himself, and sat back slowly. "Chief Dana Wilson," Morales read aloud, her voice quieter now, more reverent. "Willow Creek Police Department. You're the new chief." Dana nodded. "Started just last week. Today was my first day off." The two officers exchanged a quick, stunned glance, then both stood a little straighter, their tone shifting immediately. "I'm so sorry, Chief," Turner said, his voice filled with surprise and apology. "We had no idea." Dana gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know. And I didn't say anything because I needed to see how this would be handled. Not just by her, but by all of us." Morales' face grew more serious. "You've been through a lot today, ma'am. This shouldn't have happened." "No," Dana replied, "but it did. And the way we respond matters. Not just for me, but for the next person who gets told they don't belong, just because someone thinks they look out of place." Turner nodded slowly. "We'll start the paperwork for your complaint. And if you'd like to press charges for false reporting, that's an option as well." Dana looked out toward the water, where families were beginning to pack up their towels and snacks. Some were still watching. Others were gathering their things in quiet discomfort, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. "I'm not sure yet," Dana said honestly. "But I do want a report on file. If nothing else, there should be a record. These things shouldn't just disappear." Morales retrieved a form from her clipboard and set it on the table. "We'll help you get this started. You can complete the rest at the station if you'd prefer." Dana began filling out the form, her pen moving steadily across the page. She listed what had happened, what had been said, and how she had been treated from the moment she arrived. It wasn't just about today. It was about all the moments that looked like today, moments that people quietly endured, swallowed, excused. When she finished, Morales took the paperwork and carefully slid it into her folder. "We'll make sure this is filed properly," she said. "And Chief, thank you. For your grace. For how you handled this. Dana nodded. Thank you both. You treated me with respect even before you knew who I was. That matters to me. The officers gave her a respectful nod, and as they stood to leave, Turner looked back toward the pool. Should we tell her? He asked. Dana looked over at Susan, who still hadn't sat down. She seemed smaller now, as if unsure whether to stay or run. Yes, Dana said. Let her know exactly who I am. And with that, the truth, long overdue, began to ripple through Willow Creek, carried not by whispers or rumors this time, but by the certainty of a badge, a name, and a voice that refused to be silenced. Officer Morales walked with quiet purpose as she made her way back toward the pool, her partner just behind her. The air felt heavier now, not because of the weather, but because of what had just unfolded. Children were still splashing in the shallow end, but with less enthusiasm. A few parents began to gather towels and whisper to each other. People sensed something had happened, even if they didn't know exactly what. Susan Whitaker stood by the entrance gate, pretending to check something in her oversized purse. Her eyes darted up as the officers approached. She straightened her posture and tried to appear composed. Did you sort it out? She asked quickly, before either officer spoke. She's not really a resident, is she? I told you something didn't feel right. Morales didn't smile. Her voice was measured, professional. Yes, ma'am. We did sort it out. Susan let out a breath of relief and gave a smug nod, as if waiting for them to congratulate her. Good. I knew something was off. She was just acting so entitled, like she owned the place. Morales's next words landed like a hammer. She is a resident, she said flatly. Her membership is valid. Her ID matches. And more importantly, the woman you called about is Chief Dana Wilson. She's the newly appointed head of the Willow Creek Police Department. For a moment, Susan didn't understand. The words seemed to bounce around her, unable to sink in. Then her face froze. She's, what? She said, her voice suddenly thin and hoarse. Chief of Police, Morales repeated. Sworn in last week. Lives right here on Sycamore Lane. Susan's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her hand fluttered near her chest, as if trying to catch her breath. Her gaze wandered toward the patio, where Dana still sat with quiet dignity, watching from a distance. Their eyes met, and Susan's stomach dropped. Oh my God, she whispered. People were starting to notice. The teenage lifeguard leaned against the ladder now, watching intently. The older ladies who had once been deep in conversation had stopped playing cards. Even the toddlers had gone quiet as if sensing their parents' unease. Susan took a step back, her face pale beneath her sun hat. I didn't know, she muttered. No one told me we had a new chief. I thought she was just. She didn't finish the sentence. You thought she didn't belong, Officer Turner said, more gently than his partner but still firm. You never gave her a chance to explain. She offered to show you her card. You refused. Susan's voice was shrinking. I didn't mean to offend anyone. I was just trying to look out for the neighborhood. I wasn't trying to be racist. Turner raised an eyebrow. That's something you might want to think about, ma'am. Because how you made her feel, and how it looked to everyone else, that matters. A lot. Susan's knees felt weak. She turned her eyes back toward Dana, who had stood up now and was walking slowly in their direction. There was no anger in her steps. No bitterness. Just a calm strength that only made Susan feel smaller. As Dana approached, Susan swallowed hard. Chief Wilson, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. If I had known, I never would have. Dana's voice was steady and low. That's the problem, isn't it? You would have treated me differently if you knew who I was. But the truth is, you shouldn't have treated anyone that way, title or no title. Susan's face flushed red with shame. Her hands clutched the handles of her bag like they were the only things keeping her standing. Around them, the quiet murmur of the crowd grew. Someone took a picture with their phone. Another whispered to a friend. Susan's cheeks burned. Dana didn't raise her voice. She didn't lash out. She simply looked Susan in the eye and said, "You called the police on me in my own neighborhood. In front of families. In front of children. You told them I didn't belong. And now you want it all to go away." Susan opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I'm filing a complaint," Dana said simply. "Because what you did matters. And people need to see what it looks like when someone is held accountable." Susan nodded slowly, her eyes brimming. "I understand," she said, though her voice was barely a whisper. Dana gave her one last look before turning and walking away, her presence commanding, even in silence. The pool, the sun, the water, all remained the same. But for Susan, everything had changed. The woman who once held herself as the quiet guardian of Willow Creek had become something else entirely, an example. Not of order, but of the harm that comes when judgment replaces kindness. And that kind of shame doesn't wash off in a pool. The Willow Creek Recreation Center hadn't seen this many people gathered under one roof since the town's Memorial Day potluck. Rows of folding chairs filled the multi-purpose room, set up facing a long table draped in a navy blue cloth where the 5 members of the Homeowners Association board now sat. A small American flag stood at the corner of the room, and a table of lemonade and cookies sat untouched in the back. No one was in the mood for snacks tonight. Tension floated in the air, heavier than the July humidity outside. Normally, these monthly HOA meetings were quiet affairs. Maybe a dozen folks showed up to discuss things like replacing the tennis court nets or whether the bushes near the east gate needed trimming. But tonight was different. Tonight, over 40 residents had packed the room, seniors in linen shirts and sun visors, middle-aged couples whispering anxiously, even a few teenagers who had come just to see what all the fuss was about. At the center of the storm sat Susan Whitaker, front row, hands folded tightly in her lap, a pale yellow cardigan draped over her shoulders despite the summer heat. She kept her chin lifted, but her eyes never stopped flicking toward the door, as if hoping someone might walk in and save her from what was coming. Lester Jameson, the HOA president, cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. "Good evening, everyone. Let's come to order." The murmurs died down, though the tension didn't. "As you all know," Lester began, his voice steady but noticeably grim, "we've called this special meeting to address a serious incident involving one of our own HOA committee members, Mrs. Susan Whitaker." Susan's name hung in the air like an open wound. She shifted slightly in her seat but said nothing. "The incident in question," Lester continued, "occurred last week at our community pool. It has been confirmed, through police records and multiple eyewitness statements, that Mrs. Whitaker confronted a fellow resident, Ms. Dana Wilson, and accused her of trespassing despite her valid membership. Mrs. Whitaker refused to review Ms. Wilson's membership documentation and proceeded to contact law enforcement to have her removed." A few gasps echoed around the room. Susan clenched her hands together tighter. "What makes this situation especially concerning," Lester added, "is that Ms. Wilson is not only a legal resident of Willow Creek, but also the newly appointed chief of police." The silence that followed was deafening. A few heads turned toward the back of the room, where Dana stood quietly near the door. She had chosen not to take a seat, not because she wanted to loom or intimidate, but because she needed to be able to leave the moment things turned into theater. She was here for accountability, not drama. Lester looked down at a stack of papers before him, took a breath, and continued. "This board has received numerous written complaints from residents who were present that day and others who feel that Mrs. Whitaker's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of conduct that makes certain members of our community feel unwelcome and unfairly scrutinized." At that, a woman in a floral dress stood up. Her voice shook slightly, but she spoke with determination. "My name is Evelyn Moore," she said. "I've lived here for 10 years. Last summer, Susan approached my nephew and his friend, 2 black teenagers, at the playground and asked them what house they belonged to. They were just eating popsicles and listening to music. She told them they looked out of place. They were terrified. A few people murmured in agreement. One man nodded solemnly. She questioned my son once, too, he added. Asked if he was lost because he was skateboarding near the mailboxes. Susan's face had gone stark white. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I didn't say anything then, Evelyn continued, because I didn't want trouble. But seeing what happened to Chief Wilson made me realize how wrong it is to stay silent. Dana lowered her gaze, humbled by the support but also weary of the pain that had to be exposed for change to begin. Lester gave a small nod. Thank you, Mrs. Moore. That's exactly why we're here. He turned to the rest of the board. As per our bylaws, the HOA board has the authority to remove committee members if their behavior is deemed harmful to community harmony or violates the HOA code of conduct. We have reviewed the complaint, interviewed witnesses, and now open the floor to board discussion and a vote. The room held its breath. One by one, the board members spoke, some with more discomfort than others. A few had been friends with Susan for years. But even they could not deny the impact her actions had on the community's sense of safety and unity. I don't believe Susan is an evil person, said Margaret, a longtime board member with silver hair and gentle eyes. But good intentions don't erase harm. We need to set a precedent that our neighborhood does not tolerate racial profiling or abuse of authority. When it came time for the vote, Lester called each board member by name. Margaret Simmons? Yes. Tom Delaney? Yes. Patricia Keller? Yes. Roger Chu? Yes. Lester paused before casting his own vote. Yes, he said finally. All 5 in favor, he announced. Effective immediately, Susan Whitaker is removed from all HOA committee positions until further notice. The board will review further action once the city attorney completes their review of the official complaint filed by Chief Wilson. The verdict landed like thunder. Susan sat frozen, her eyes blinking rapidly. Her breath came in short bursts, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. I was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe, she said finally, her voice weak and cracking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't know who she was. Lester's voice was firm. That's the problem, Susan. You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with basic respect. No one clapped. No one cheered. The room wasn't celebrating, it was reckoning. As people stood and began to file out, Dana quietly approached the board table and thanked the members for their time. Her presence was steady, composed. She didn't linger. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded and turned to leave, brushing past Susan, who sat still in her seat, shoulders hunched, eyes on the floor. Outside, the crickets chirped in the dusky air, and the street lamps began to flicker on one by one. The world outside Willow Creek continued turning. But inside that room, something important had shifted. Not justice in its entirety, but the beginning of it. A door cracked open. A curtain pulled back. And for the first time in a long time, Willow Creek was being asked to truly see itself. A week after the HOA board meeting, Susan Whitaker sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at the letter in her hands. The crisp, official envelope had arrived that morning, bearing the seal of the city attorney's office. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read through the contents, her eyes scanning the carefully worded paragraphs. She had been expecting the worst, a notice of formal charges, maybe even a court summons. But instead, the letter offered something unexpected, a restorative justice process. An alternative to legal prosecution, the letter explained, where both parties could meet with a trained mediator, share their experiences, and attempt to find a path toward understanding, accountability, and resolution. Susan's first instinct was to feel insulted. She wasn't some criminal. She wasn't someone who needed to be rehabilitated. But even as the defensive thoughts flickered through her mind, a deeper truth pressed against her. She was scared. Scared of the public spotlight. Scared of being dragged into court. Scared of what her neighbors already thought of her. And then came the most uncomfortable fear of all, the fear that maybe, just maybe, she had done something wrong. Jim sat across from her, his coffee growing cold. He had been quiet since reading the letter himself, but now he reached out and gently placed his hand over hers. "I think you should do it," he said softly. Susan looked up, her eyes wide. "But it means admitting I was wrong." Jim gave a small nod. "Maybe that's what's needed right now. Not for the neighborhood. For you." The word stayed with her. That afternoon, she picked up the phone and called the number listed at the bottom of the letter. The woman who answered spoke gently, explained the process, and scheduled a meeting for later that week at the city's community center. When the day came, Susan dressed carefully, modestly, respectfully. She wore a navy blouse, slacks, and low-heeled shoes, not because anyone expected it, but because it felt like armor. Her hands were cold as she walked into the small meeting room, where a round table sat beneath soft fluorescent lights. A pot of coffee and a tray of cookies sat untouched in the corner. Dana was already there. Susan froze for a moment, unsure if she should move forward. Dana sat calmly, hands folded on the table, her expression unreadable but not unkind. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood and greeted Susan quietly. "Please, have a seat. We're here today to talk openly, listen honestly, and if possible, work towards some kind of repair." Susan sat down, her throat tight. She could barely meet Dana's gaze. The mediator began by outlining the format. Each person would speak without interruption. There would be honesty. There would be accountability. There would not be blame shifting or justifications. And then she nodded toward Susan. "Would you like to begin?" Susan's voice cracked on the first word. I'm sorry," she said, her breath catching. "I didn't realize how much damage I caused that day at the pool. I thought I was helping. I thought I was protecting something. But I see now that I wasn't protecting anything but my own comfort." She swallowed hard, eyes beginning to shine. "I didn't know who you were, Dana. But that shouldn't have mattered. I didn't stop to think how it would feel, to be questioned like that, to have the police called on you for simply existing." Dana listened, her face still and calm. Then she spoke quietly. "You didn't just question me, Susan. You assumed the worst of me. You treated me like I didn't belong in a place I had every right to be. And the worst part is, this happens to people like me all the time." Susan wiped at her eyes, nodding. "I know. Or at least, I'm starting to understand." The meeting lasted nearly an hour. It was not easy. But it was honest. And by the end, Susan agreed to take part in community education, volunteer hours, and to issue a public apology. Not just because it was asked of her, but because she needed to. For the first time, Susan didn't just feel guilt. She felt responsibility. And that was the beginning of something new. The second session of the restorative justice meeting was set for a cool Thursday afternoon, just as a light breeze swept through the trees lining the sidewalks of Willow Creek. Inside the community center, the same modest conference room waited, for chairs around a circular table, neutral-colored walls, a pitcher of water, and the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. It was simple, quiet, and unassuming, which made it the perfect setting for a conversation that would be anything but. Susan Whitaker arrived early. She clutched her purse with both hands as she sat down, the silence stretching long before anyone else entered. She had barely slept the night before, thoughts racing through her mind like a broken film reel. What would she say? What could she say that would make a difference? She had rehearsed apologies in the mirror, discarded dozens of drafts, and found herself again and again at the edge of a truth she had long refused to name. When Dana arrived 10 minutes later, her presence was steady, composed. She greeted the mediator politely, then nodded toward Susan. "Good afternoon." Susan stood awkwardly and murmured a greeting, then sat back down, smoothing her skirt more times than necessary. The mediator, Miss Harper, a woman with gentle eyes and a firm voice, sat between them. She folded her hands and looked at Susan. "Today is your opportunity to speak freely, Mrs. Whitaker. Last time, you expressed remorse. This time, we'd like to go deeper, if you're ready. Susan swallowed hard and nodded. I've done a lot of thinking, she began, her voice shaking. More than I ever have in my life, I think. She looked across the table at Dana, who remained silent, eyes calm but unflinching. I've always thought of myself as a good person, Susan said, a bitter laugh catching in her throat. I go to church. I bake cookies for the community fair. I've never raised my voice in public. I thought that meant I couldn't be someone who discriminates. She paused and looked down at her hands. But I was wrong. Dana said nothing, allowing her the space to continue. I assumed you didn't belong at the pool because I didn't recognize you. I saw your face, your skin, and my mind went straight to suspicion. I didn't stop to ask you kindly. I didn't accept your offer to show me your card. I didn't even think for a second that you could be a resident, let alone the chief of police. Tears welled in Susan's eyes, and she didn't wipe them away. I let my fear and my narrow view of what belonging looks like guide my actions. And the worst part is, I never realized until now how often I've done that, maybe not as dramatically, maybe not with police calls, but with glances, with questions, with a certain tone. Dana leaned slightly forward, her voice even. Why now, Susan? Why are you seeing it now? Susan didn't answer right away. Her tears slipped down her cheeks. Because this time, she whispered, someone held up a mirror. And I didn't like what I saw. She drew in a shaky breath. I made you feel unwelcome. I humiliated you in front of strangers. And I know that's not something a single apology can fix. But I am sorry. I am so sorry. Dana took a breath, her own throat tight. Do you understand what it's like to live with that kind of doubt? To be in a new place and feel people watching you, questioning you, not for what you do, but for who you are. I didn't, Susan admitted. But I'm starting to. Dana nodded. It's not just about me. There are other people in this neighborhood, people of color, teenagers, immigrants, who've felt that same judgment, that same distrust. I've heard stories since that day at the pool. And many of them start with the same line. Susan stopped me and asked if I lived here. Susan covered her mouth with one hand, her shoulders trembling. I didn't realize it was so many. I thought I was just being careful. You were being biased, Dana said gently but firmly. Even if you didn't mean to be. And your position in the HOA gave you power you didn't use responsibly. Susan nodded slowly. I see that now. I abused that trust. I wasn't protecting the neighborhood. I was protecting my idea of it. And I'm ashamed. The mediator stepped in. Susan, this is a step forward. A real step. But restorative justice isn't just about words, it's about change. What are you prepared to do to make things right? Susan straightened slightly, as if drawing from something deeper than her shame. I've signed up for the town's diversity and inclusion workshop. I've agreed to complete community service hours with the youth program. And I've written a public apology, which I plan to read at the next HOA meeting. No excuses, no defense, just truth. Dana studied her for a long moment. That matters. But what matters more is what you do when no one's watching. The real test is how you treat the next person you don't recognize. I know, Susan whispered. I hope you'll give me the chance to prove I've changed. There was silence for a beat, a moment where both women simply looked at each other, one filled with regret, the other with hard-won strength. Then Dana gave a quiet nod. We'll see. And that, perhaps, was the most honest response of all. Not forgiveness, not yet. But a door left open, a willingness to see what came next. As the session ended, the sun peeked through the window, casting long shadows on the table. Susan stood slowly, her shoulders a little less heavy than when she entered. Dana followed, her steps quiet, but certain. They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. But they walked out of that room, side by side, not in friendship, not in agreement, but in something more powerful. A shared understanding that the past could not be undone. But the future might still be different. The next Willow Creek HOA meeting was held on a warm, clear Tuesday evening, just as the cicadas began their nightly hum and porch lights blinked on across the neighborhood. Unlike the previous gathering, there was no tension in the air, at least, not the same kind. This time, the room was filled with a quiet anticipation, the kind that sits just under the surface when people sense something important is about to happen. The multi-purpose room at the recreation center filled quickly. Folding chairs scraped against the floor, murmurs passed between neighbors, and the lemonade table in the back saw far more visitors than usual. Everyone knew why they were there. Susan Whitaker was going to speak. She hadn't been seen much around town since the fallout from the incident at the pool. A few had spotted her walking her dog early in the mornings or getting groceries at odd hours, but mostly she had kept to herself. The woman who once knew everyone's name, who proudly organized potlucks and parades, had retreated into near invisibility. But tonight, she had asked to be added to the meeting's agenda. Not to defend herself. Not to argue. But to apologize, formally, publicly. Lester Jameson, still serving as HOA president, stepped up to the microphone at the front of the room and tapped it gently. "Let's bring the meeting to order." The rustling and whispering faded. Eyes turned forward. Lester looked out across the crowd, then nodded once. "We have a special speaker this evening," he said. "Mrs. Susan Whitaker has asked to address the community." There was a pause, a beat of silence. Then Susan stood from the second row, holding a sheet of paper in both hands. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a modest navy blue blouse. No jewelry, no makeup. Just her and the words she hoped would begin to mend what had been broken. She walked to the front of the room slowly. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, the sound oddly loud in the quiet room. When she reached the microphone, she took a breath, looked down at her paper, then looked out at her neighbors. Many faces stared back at her, some curious, some skeptical, some weary, and a few, perhaps, hopeful. "My name is Susan Whitaker," she began, her voice quivering but clear. "And I owe this community, and most especially, Chief Dana Wilson, a sincere and heartfelt apology." A hush fell over the room, heavier than before. "Several weeks ago, I made a terrible mistake," she continued. "At the community pool, I confronted Chief Wilson, without cause, without fairness, and without kindness. I saw someone I didn't recognize, and instead of welcoming her or simply asking a question respectfully, I made assumptions. I accused her. I called the police." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some glanced toward the back of the room, where Dana stood against the wall, arms loosely crossed, listening in silence. "I was wrong," Susan said. "I let fear and bias guide my behavior instead of empathy and reason. I thought I was protecting our neighborhood, but in reality, I was protecting my own narrow view of who belongs. That's not community. That's prejudice." Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "I've spent the past few weeks reflecting, listening, and learning, things I should have done a long time ago. I participated in restorative justice sessions, attended diversity workshops, and volunteered with the youth program. But more importantly, I've had conversations, real, honest conversations, with people I once overlooked. People who helped me see what I couldn't, or wouldn't, before." She paused to let the weight of her words settle. "I know an apology doesn't undo the pain I caused. I know trust isn't earned back with a speech. But I stand here tonight to say this: I am deeply sorry. To Chief Wilson, to the families who felt unwelcome, and to every person who's ever been made to feel like a stranger in their own home." Susan took a shaky breath and folded her paper. "I am committed to doing better. To being better. And I hope, over time, you'll see that in my actions." She stepped back from the microphone, hands trembling slightly. The room was still. Then, from the back, someone began to clap. Slowly at first. Then another joined. Then more. It wasn't thunderous or overwhelming, but it was sincere. The kind of applause that says, "We hear you. We're watching. Let's see what happens next." Susan blinked back tears as she returned to her seat. Dana remained at the back of the room, expression calm but unreadable. She didn't clap, but she gave a small nod, just once, when Susan passed her on the way out. And somehow, that single nod meant more than a standing ovation ever could. The summer days in Willow Creek began to feel different after that. Not overnight, change never comes that fast, but gradually, like the slow turn of a season. The air still carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming crepe myrtles, but there was something else too. A shift in the way neighbors spoke to one another. And how long they lingered during walks, how carefully they listened during meetings, how often they looked each other in the eye. At the center of it all was Chief Dana Wilson. For many, she had become more than a name or a title. She was a presence, steady, calm, and unshakable. The woman who had endured public humiliation with grace and had chosen not revenge, but reform. And people noticed. More than that, they respected her for it. It started with small things. A group of teenagers who had once been wary of police presence began waving at Dana's cruiser as she passed. Older residents, those who had initially kept their distance, now greeted her with warmth at the grocery store or after Sunday services. She never called attention to herself. She didn't need to. Her integrity spoke louder than any badge ever could. But Dana wasn't content to simply be respected. She had come to Willow Creek to make a difference, and she wasn't going to let the pool incident define her or the community. So she got to work. She started by holding listening sessions at the station and formal gatherings open to the public. Coffee and cookies were served in the lobby, and folks were invited to speak freely. At first, only a handful of residents showed up. But word spread. By the third session, the room was nearly full. People spoke about things they'd never said aloud before. A young mother shared how her biracial son had been followed home from school by someone who claimed to be just making sure he belonged. An older black veteran talked about being asked to prove his residency near the basketball courts. There were tears. There was discomfort. But there was also healing. Dana never interrupted. She just listened, nodded, took notes. Then, when everyone had spoken, she would speak, briefly, firmly, and always with purpose. "We can't fix what we won't face," she told them. "And we can't build trust unless we're willing to hold each other accountable, including ourselves." From there, she proposed changes. Modest ones, at first. Clearer HOA policies on resident identification. Bias training for neighborhood watch volunteers. Outreach programs with local schools. All of it focused not just on preventing future incidents, but on building a culture where everyone, regardless of background, felt like they belonged. The town council took notice. So did the mayor. Though he had once suggested Dana let the matter go for the sake of appearances, he now saw the effect her leadership was having. At a public event in late August, he introduced her with visible pride. "Chief Wilson," he said, "is showing us all what real leadership looks like, firm when it must be, humble when it can be, and always rooted in what's right." Dana accepted the acknowledgement with a quiet smile. But she didn't dwell on it. Praise wasn't her goal, progress was. At the police department, she instituted new protocols for community engagement. Officers were encouraged to spend more time walking their beats, speaking with residents, attending town events, and participating in the same workshops the community was offered. She wasn't interested in lip service. She wanted her officers to understand the people they served, and for the people to feel safe around those in uniform. She even started a mentorship program for local youth interested in public service. Every Saturday morning, a small group of students met at the station for discussions, guest speakers, and hands-on activities. Dana led many of the sessions herself, taking time to answer questions, share her journey, and listen to theirs. "You don't have to wear a badge to serve," she told them one morning. "You just need to care enough to try." The mural painted by the kids in the youth program still hung proudly in the community center, bright handprints of every shade surrounding the words, "Our community. Our home." One afternoon, as Dana stood admiring the mural, a woman approached her quietly. She had short gray hair, nervous eyes, and carried a small envelope in her hand. "Chief Wilson," the woman said softly. "You don't know me, but I want to thank you for what you've done here, for how you handled everything." Dana turned, smiling gently. "I appreciate that." The woman handed her the envelope. "It's a letter from my husband. He wasn't ready to say it in person, but he wanted you to know he sees things differently now. He's learning." Dana held the envelope close to her chest. "That's all any of us can do. Keep learning." And that was the kind of leader she had become, one who didn't seek control or command with noise. One who made people feel seen, and in doing so, gave them the courage to see others more clearly. In Willow Creek, the past wasn't forgotten. But because of Dana Wilson, it didn't have to define the future. It started quietly, just a small gesture, unnoticed by most. A week after the public apology, Susan Whitaker showed up at the community center on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. She didn't bring her usual clipboard or try to organize anything. She simply asked if the youth coordinator needed help setting up for the weekend art program. No cameras. No crowd. Just a woman with her sleeves rolled up and something to prove, not to others, but to herself. The youth coordinator, Miss Lillian Daniels, a kind woman in her 50s who had seen her share of broken promises, raised an eyebrow when Susan offered. But something in Susan's eyes, tired but sincere, made her nod. "We'll see how you do with paintbrushes first," she said with a small smile. That first day, Susan helped lay out smocks and organize supplies. She stayed quiet, letting the kids lead conversations, laughing when a little boy named Marcus splattered blue paint across her slacks. She didn't correct anyone. She didn't direct. She just helped. And for once, that was enough. The next week, she returned. And the week after that. Before long, she was a regular presence in the youth art program and weekend reading circle. She read books aloud to kindergartners in her soft, patient voice. She passed out snacks and sat cross-legged on the floor while children showed her their crayon drawings of dragons and dream houses. She listened more than she spoke. Word got around, of course. Some were skeptical. "She's just trying to clean up her image," one parent muttered. "Maybe so," another replied. "But I'll take someone trying over someone hiding." Dana heard the rumors too, but she chose to watch instead of judge. And what she saw, week after week, was a woman who kept showing up. Rain or shine, Susan came. She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't complain when assigned menial tasks. She simply served. One afternoon, during a youth leadership workshop Dana led at the station, she spotted Susan sitting quietly at the back, handing out notebooks to a group of middle schoolers. She wore jeans and a Willow Creek Youth Program t-shirt. A far cry from the woman in the straw hat at the pool that summer day. Dana approached her later, curiosity softening her tone. "You've been doing a lot of work here," she said. Susan looked up, startled, then nodded. "I figured it was time I gave back to the part of this community I never took the time to see." Dana studied her for a moment. "Do the kids know who you are?" "Some do," Susan admitted. "Marcus told me I look like the mean lady from his aunt's phone video." Dana chuckled. "And what did you say?" "I told him that sometimes grown-ups mess up in big ways, but if they're lucky, they get a chance to fix it." Dana nodded slowly. "Keep showing up, Susan." "I will," she said. "Not for redemption. Just because it's right." And she did. Susan never reclaimed her old titles, never ran for the HOA board again. She didn't need to. She had found a different place, one where she wasn't in charge, but where she was useful. Where she was learning. And where, every time a child reached out to grab her hand or show her their drawing, she was reminded that change didn't have to come in grand gestures. Sometimes, it came in little hands covered in paint, reaching out anyway. The air was crisp with the first signs of autumn as Willow Creek gathered for its annual fall festival. Leaves in shades of amber and gold drifted from the trees lining Maple Avenue, and the scent of cinnamon, roasted corn, and wood smoke lingered in the air. The community park had been transformed into a cozy celebration, hay bales stacked near picnic tables, kids in face paint darting between games, and neighbors wrapped in scarves and flannel chatting over hot apple cider. It was a scene that felt warm and familiar, like something out of a memory. Yet this year, it felt different. Better. Lighter. As if the town, after all its upheaval and reckoning, had finally begun to exhale. Dana Wilson strolled through the park, sipping cider from a paper cup, her coat buttoned against the breeze. People greeted her with smiles and nods, not just out of respect for her title, but with genuine warmth. Children from the youth program waved as they passed, some calling out, "Hi, Chief Dana," before scampering off to the pumpkin painting station. She smiled, her heart full. This was the kind of moment she had envisioned when she first accepted the role, one where the town could come together not in conflict, but in connection. Near the refreshment stand, she paused beside a mural that had been mounted on a wooden display board. Dozens of painted handprints in every size and color formed a circle around the words "Our Community." Our Home. The children from the youth program had created it together, guided by volunteers. She was admiring the work when a familiar voice, hesitant but sincere, broke the quiet. "I helped them with that," the voice said. "The handprint design, it was my idea." Dana turned slowly. Susan Whitaker stood a few feet away, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. She wore a simple knit sweater and jeans, her hair swept back. She looked unsure of whether to stay or turn around, but she didn't move. Dana took a moment before answering. "It's beautiful," she said gently. "They did a great job." Susan nodded, her eyes fixed on the mural. "They did. I just passed out brushes." Silence stretched between them for a moment, filled only by the laughter of children in the distance and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. "I wasn't sure I should come today," Susan said finally. "Thought maybe people would still look at me a certain way." Dana's gaze was steady. "Some might. But showing up matters. Especially when it's not easy." Susan nodded again, her throat tight. "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I wouldn't want that, honestly. I needed to change. I just hope that, in time, people will see I meant it." Dana looked back at the mural. "I think some already do." For the first time in a long while, Susan allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you for giving me the chance to learn, to do better." Dana extended her hand, and Susan looked at it for a heartbeat before reaching out and taking it in hers. The handshake was brief, quiet, but full of meaning. Not a grand reconciliation, not a public performance, but a private moment of grace between two women who had walked through fire and come out, if not healed, then at least changed. And that was enough, for now. As they stood together by the mural, children laughed nearby, music from a local band floated across the breeze, and the autumn sun broke briefly through the clouds, warming the path ahead. Willow Creek, like its people, was still learning. But today, it felt just a little more whole. In life, it's easy to judge what we don't understand. We see someone unfamiliar, and without meaning harm, we let assumptions take root. But the truth is, kindness and humility go further than suspicion ever will. This story reminds us that we all carry blind spots, ways of thinking shaped by habit, fear, or upbringing. But it's never too late to change. When we listen, truly listen, to others, we open the door to understanding, healing, and community. For those of us who have lived many seasons, we know how quickly life can shift. Friendships, neighborhoods, even reputations can be changed by one moment of grace or one act of harm. What matters most is what we do after the moment passes. Do we stay silent, or do we take responsibility? Do we hold grudges, or do we offer second chances? Whether we're righting a wrong or forgiving one, we can choose growth over pride, compassion over comfort. Respect, after all, isn't about agreeing with everyone. It's about treating people with dignity, even when it's difficult. In our everyday lives, may we remember, The way we treat others, especially strangers, is the truest reflection of who we are. And it's never too late to become someone better.